Alrighty, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Holly, and I'm the programs coordinator here at the Osgoode Township Museum. Our executive director, James, will also be joining us tonight to help us with any tech issues that might come up. And I'll just begin with a quick land acknowledgement. So the Osgoode Township Museum acknowledges that our museum, located in Vernon, Ontario, just south of Ottawa, is on the traditional unceded ancestral land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of this territory along the Ottawa, Rideau, and Castor rivers and have lived on this land since time immemorial. And we are very grateful to be gathering here tonight to share stories as generations before us also have. If you've never been to the museum before, the Osgoode Township Museum tells the story of Ottawa's agricultural and rural heritage in the former Osgoode Township. We are open all year round, and we have some, in my opinion, very fun programs coming up soon. So we're kind of in full swing for winter programs. We are currently doing an ongoing knit along program focusing on a brand new knitting pattern called the Osgoode stocking. It was designed for us based off of a pair of socks in our collection, original to 1907. So our second meeting is going to be on February 28th, and the pattern is for sale at the museum if you're interested in knitting along with us. The following dates for that are also March 28th and then April 18th, and that will kind of wrap up the knit along series for the stocking pattern. Our next museum talk is on March 26th, and it's all about cross stitch samplers. So if you're interested in textile history or women's history as well, this will be a great event to come to. The registration is already open on Eventbrite, and there's more details on our website for that. And then finally, our March break drop-in program is back. All of the themes have been announced on our website, and the registration will be coming soon if you're interested. So as we get into the presentation, I'll be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to type them in as we go along, and I'll relay them to our speaker during the Q&A after the presentation. So I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Christine Lavallee. Christine is an independent researcher conducting case studies on Canada's early romance authors. With her current focus on Julia Beckwith Hart, her passionate enthusiasm has gained the attention of Heritage Minutes and the Kingston Historical Society. As Christine has a form of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, she has to balance her research with her health, and romance novels have kept a positive mindset and hopes to share that joy about them with others. You can read about her first case study about Julia Beckwith Hart's novel on her Substack, Hart and Company. So with that, I will I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass the virtual mic to Christine.
Before I begin, I just want to thank Holly, especially for coordinating this event. I've had a really good time talking to her and James, and I really encourage you guys to check out the museum. I can really tell that they're passionate about what they're doing there, and I'm looking forward to participating in more of their events. But tonight I'm going to be talking about Canada's romance authors, and this started as a hobby of mine, and one of the ways I started looking into them was by creating a Google map of where they all came from. And I think, as you can see, it kind of establishes a good starting point because you can tell that a lot of them came from the Maritimes, Ontario, and Quebec initially, and then slowly went to the west. Primarily due to how Canada formed as a country, but also how the publishing industry developed over time. I'll get more into where Canadians got published, but I really enjoy showing this map to people because it shows you where the authors came from, and it sort of helps give an idea about their backgrounds. So for me, I really like to start off with a definition of romance because in the publishing industry, this can be a bit of a controversial topic because romance readers really know what they're looking for. And in some areas of the publishing world, this can come into conflict with terms like romantic literature and love story. For my research, I decided it was really important to have a definition so that I could narrow down my scope. And also, it's important to recognize that it's not always considered important area of study in Canada, but it is still very important to readers, and is getting more traction. And um, for me, I decided that the definition it required obstacles for the couples to overcome in order to have a satisfying ending. And I actually gained this definition from a book by Dr. Pamela Regis called A Natural History of the Romance Novel, which I really recommend. It was a great starting point for me. And she also made me wonder, would the story exist without the couples? Would it be a romance novel without the couples? Could this could the story develop without them? So really, essentially, for a romance novel to exist, it needs to have a couple who is overcoming obstacles. A lot of people may consider books like Wuthering Heights or Romeo and Juliet um, romance novels, but to the modern day reader, that no longer fits the definition that they're looking for. They're more so to be called tragedies or gothic romance, depending on the elements found in the novel. And this can be a bit of a source of contention for romance readers and publishers, as publishers are trying to find the right stream to fit their books in. But one way I like to present it to people is if you hypothetically went to a bookstore for a mystery book and were looking for an Agatha Christie, and it was a new book you hadn't read by her, and it no longer had that um, aspects of a mystery novel that you were expecting, you as a reader would feel let down. That's similar to how a romance reader would feel if they were told that a new and upcoming book was a romance novel, but it didn't have the happy ending that they were expecting. Just go to the next page. So why do I find it important to research romance or fiction as a whole? So my hobby actually started back in university when I was taking English literature at the University of Victoria. And I had a Canadian literature professor ask us how we view the future of Canadian publishing. And I was a bit cheeky and I told her I thought it was evolving. And she said back to me, well, that's a bit positive. And I was like, well, yeah. And ever since then, I made it my mission to find ways that I could highlight Canadian authors, and I was really pleased that I got an A on my research in university on that. But on the other side, there's also the fact that romance novels really reflect and challenge social norms in relationships and how women express what they want in society. It's also part of Freedom to Read for me. Freedom to Read, if you don't know, is a week in North America, especially where we observe books that have been challenged or censored across the world. A lot of romance novels have been published have faced a lot of censorship and critique, especially in high school libraries. And that's another a discussion for another time, but it is a major reason for why I'm so passionate about this. It's also, according to Book Riot and other sources, one of the most popular genres in the publishing industry, and honestly, it does make the most money. So for me, I think it's one of those underlooked parts of the book world by a lot of readers. But it's also part of art history as well, which I get really excited about because I will be showing some uh, examples of how illustrators have been involved with the book publishing process over the course of time since probably the 1970s, especially. And this started my interest in the art history aspect actually started with the hashtag Step Back Saturday. I really encourage you guys to look this up on Instagram. It was started by a Canadian mom, and since then it's taken off as a bit of a niche on Instagram, and it really looks into the art history of romance novels. So to help illustrate that a bit more, I have some copies of what are called step backs. And in old novels, you'll open up the romance novel, and on the inner part of the front cover, you'll often see a display um, the main characters in order to capture the passion and the love that is felt within the storylines. It's very interesting now to see these pieces of art because as book covers evolve, one of the interesting trends has actually been replacing artwork with cartoons, and that's has been a way of somewhat hiding uh, romance and passionate illustrations that usually appear on front covers and replacing them more with cartoon illustrations so that readers feel more comfortable reading them in public. But as you can see, it also displays how romance readers have evolved in how they capture or expect romance heroes and heroines to appear. So we have started with this depiction of a tall, dark, and handsome stranger, and more recently, there's been a more demand for diverse heroes and heroines. But it's a really good way of looking back and seeing how romance novels have evolved over time. So in the 19th century, which is um, when the author lived, there were different platforms, although initially scarce, that Canadian authors were looking to get their works published. So the literary Garland was one of the first um, platforms for Canadian authors to get their works done. It was started in Montreal in the early 19th century, and it was a great platform for Canadians who were initially going to American publishers to get their works published. And initially, before fiction really became popular and accepted, it was primarily nonfiction that women were writing. So this could have been poetry, religious commentary, and moral stories. I actually found a cookbook that has been modernized at my local library. It's called Miss Dalgarn's Kitchen, and I hope you can see it. I'll just see if I can see. Yeah. So this is a copy of the second edition of the cookbook that the Julia Hart would have used, and it's a modernized take on the book. And I've really enjoyed just looking through it, and I highly encourage you guys to get a copy of it. And it really shows what they would have eaten and how they would have just done normal life with, and how they would have what they could have afforded back then for food. And this is actually part of my organic research, and it also shows what kind of formats of writing was acceptable back then. And another thing that I love to point out to Canadians is that Harlequin romance, which is often seen as a oh, sorry, did I just close? I think I minimized it. Sorry, we'll get back to that. Harlequin romance is often seen as a bit of a stereotype of romance novels, but it's really become diverse nowadays. And I like to point out to Canadians that it was actually started in Winnipeg by a fur trader. It was eventually bought out by American businesses and publishers, but Harlequin romance really tried to get Canadian authors and Commonwealth authors to publish romance novels. And there's actually quite a few Harlequin romance authors who are still alive today who were the first trailblazers of that publishing house. Another cool area that romance authors found ways to publish was dime novels in Quebec. And there's a current study being done by a professor at the University of Sherbrooke. And it's really interesting looking at the research and seeing how French readers today and even back then have been enjoying fiction reading. And that takes us to romance today. And so I actually really encourage people to look up Bookstagram because that's a wonderful way of discovering Canadian contemporary authors. And also, there's a blogger called Canlit Romance, and she has a wonderful it's a newsletter that goes out about pretty much monthly now, where she updates romance events and news about romance authors that Canadian readers can follow. So these are just notable trailblazers that I like to point out. For my own research, I like to focus on authors who started writing from 1824 to 2000. I've learned the hard way that the more you try to focus on authors who are still alive, the more chances they are that exist that they may not um, appreciate everything you have to say about their current work. So it's better to study authors who have passed away, at least in my case. So one author that I really love to read about is Evelyn Eaton. She's possibly the first Indigenous fiction author that I can find with Canadian connections. She has some books that I would say are more akin to Gone with the Wind, but The Sea is So Wide is a book that has a romance plot and actually talks about the Acadian expulsion. So it's actually set in Canada. Another cool author is Joe Beverly, who helped establish the Ottawa Romance Writing Group, and it's still being run today. So, who was Julia Hart? She was born in 1796 in the Maritimes, and she was actually a teenager during the War of 1812. This was really important and really impacted her romance novel, St. Ursula's Convent. Her parents lived in the American Revolution, and North America in itself was very war torn, and war has really plagued the society back then. And you can see the themes of war and patriotism in her novels. So unfortunately, because her father died in a tragic drowning accident, she ended up moving to Kingston so that she can help her mother make ends meet. While in Kingston, she did start a boarding school, and it's very interesting to look up old newspapers and find old advertisements for that boarding school. And just from her writing style and her abilities as a teacher, you're able to get the sense that Julia Hart was very well educated. It's important to note that her mother was also a woman of letters, and a researcher, Phileas Gagnon, actually managed to find a lot of her family's letters, and they're available at an archival place in Montreal. She wrote, she wrote St. Ursula's Convent during the War of 1812 as a teenager. It wasn't published until 1824. So she also later published Tonwante and Edith or the Doom, but it was never the second one was never published. Tonwante was actually published in the States. She briefly lived there after publishing her novel in Kingston. But the tone is very different. You can tell there are American influences on the book, and her views are more Americanized. But St. Ursula's Convent is more Canadian for sure. Through her literary preferences, you can tell that she really was passionate about abolitionism, and even though she has minor references to Indigenous individuals and minorities in her work, you can tell that it was very much on her mind. Abolitionism was very much on her mind, and that she was very much aware of what others were going through in society. Of note, she was also a mother, and her Christian values are very apparent in her work. I really like to show this map. It's from the year 1822, and it just gives you a good idea of what Canada would have looked like for the author. She lived in Kingston for a good part of her life, where she married, and I'll get more into that in a bit. But yeah, I just like showing this map as it gives good historical context for what North America was like at that point in time. So a bit more about Julia Hart's family. I like going over these points because they were a big influence on her writing. Her grandfather arrived in Quebec under General Montcalm, and he actually was a turncoat during the American Revolution after being arrested. And he unfortunately abused his position as a lawyer. He became a bit of a disgrace as he was accused of sexual assault, unfortunately. And he was not very good friends with General Carleton, which actually was a bit of a contention point for her mother because she was most likely the governess of General Carleton's nieces. There is also an interesting note that at one point she rejected her Catholic faith to become a Methodist. There is a myth that she did this to become a dramatic figure in history. I think it's more so to distance herself from her family, as she was part of General Carleton's household through his brother. But the author's father was a well-established shipbuilder named Nehemiah Beckwith, and he actually had an unfortunate ship business with the trader Benedict Arnold, who was infamous during the American Revolution. Now, due to that unfortunate business with Benedict Arnold, Nehemiah Beckwith became very financially destitute, and at one point drowned, which led Julia Hart to leave her family and live with relatives in Kingston. So during her time in Kingston, as I mentioned, she became a teacher and started a boarding school for girls. And during that time, she met George Henry Hart, who was a bookbinder. And we believe that because of her husband, she met a publisher and newspaper man who would later publish her book. So this is what the book would have looked like. It's very cool to see this in person. Whenever you see 19th century books, it's very shocking to see how thin and small they are. This copy is at Brock University Archives, and they're very kind to take a very lovely photo for me. But up close, it's very tiny, but it gives you a sense of how fragile the pages are now. But it's really amazing that we still have copies of her book still today. So this is a summary that I have put together for you guys. So I'll try to give a good synopsis. So St. Ursula's Convent, or the Nun of Canada, was her first book. It was first published in 1824. So as the summary goes, St. Ursula's Convent is a Gothic romance set during Georgian Canada. After her father loses his merchant ship, Julia's family moved to Canada from France, where they find new beginnings. Sadly, Julia finds out that her husband has gone missing during the siege of Quebec. Numbed by a series of personal losses, Julia becomes a nun and takes the name Mother St. Catherine. Even though she remains in the shelter of the convent walls, the world still finds her through the presence of young girls coming to the convent for education. One of them is the innocent Adelaide, whose own dramatic love story helps unravel the truth about Julia's husband. One thing I like to point out to people is the themes that occur in this novel are pretty dramatic. There is at least 2 cases of switched at birth, and fortunately for one of the characters, that is resolved because Adelaide almost marries her brother, which is almost a case of incest, but that stopped just in time. And Jane Austen would be very proud of the amount of marriages that happen at the end of the novel. Most of the characters get married, which I think would make Jane Austen very proud. And for those who aren't aware of Jane Austen, she is a very popular British author who is very iconic for her early British romance novels. So, a bit of Hart's writing style. She uses very lengthy sentences, so if you decide to read the ebook that I have reformatted, just be prepared. That was very normal for 19th century authors. She uses a dramatic word choice to convey the passion and earnestness of her plot, and also the sensation of her themes. She also likes to emphasize the drama with epigraphs and paragraph dividers to emphasize time or to create a sense of intensity or dramatic flair. And this is called the dinkus. Themes such as identity and inheritance are really important in the novel. So, influences on her writing. Gothic literature was definitely important to Julia Hart's writing. I'm just going to look up my notes real quick. But the author I'm thinking of that was really influential to Julia Hart was Anne Radcliffe, who was a prominent Gothic author during that time, as well as Jane Austen. There is a really interesting Jane Austen specialist called Juliet Wells, who did an article for JASA, which is the Jane Austen Society, and she pointed out that Julia Hart did a similar dedication on her book to Lady Dalhousie, which is reminiscent to how Jane Austen dedicated Emma to the Prince Regent at the time. And through Juliet Wells' research and from what I've seen in newspapers of the time, it's very likely that Julia Hart read Sense and Sensibility and Emma, at the very least. She may have read more of Jane Austen's works, but I'm pretty sure that she would have read those. Also, Catholic family members were very influential to Julia Hart. Her cousin was a Catholic historian, and even the relatives that she lived with back in Kingston were Catholic. But one thing I deeply appreciate about Julia Hart was that despite her family's differences on religion and cultural differences, as she had French relatives, was that she still made a point to visit them and stay in touch. And we still have at least one letter between the author and her French Catholic cousin. She also had at least one relative who became a nun. It's also important to note that there was a lot of anti-Catholic rhetoric in Gothic novels at the time, and that created a sense of sensationalism. And that's also one of the reasons why we have two school systems in Canada due to that anti-Catholic rhetoric in politics and as well as literature. So I wanted to also go back a bit to mention a bit of information about Hugh C. Thompson, who was a publisher. He lived from 1791 to 1834. He married Elizabeth Rotan, and she's important to note because she was the first Canadian woman to help run a Canadian newspaper. He eventually went into politics after being in business and publishing, but once he went into politics, she helped run his newspaper, which is initially how they found subscribers for Julia Hart. And how authors found subscribers to buy their book is very similar to how authors nowadays might use Kickstarter. And when you look at the first edition of her book, you can see how many copies were sold on the first run, as well as how many subscribers there were and where they came from. So from that information, I can tell you that 165 copies were sold initially, and that a lot of her subscribers were people from high class society and people who may have known her brother as well, as he was mayor of Fredericton at the time. At one point, her publisher did get involved with the Kingston Penitentiary, which is a very infamous or famous author, prison in Kingston, and he was involved with prison reform. He is also buried in Kingston, and I was able to visit his grave at one point, which is very interesting. So other notable researchers are Phileas Gagnon, and he's a big reason for why we still have a lot of the letters in the archives in Montreal. And Douglas Lochhead did a lot of research in accumulating that research. Current researchers include myself, and Dr. Christine Lavallee was very, very helpful in answering my questions. She works at the University of New Brunswick, and one of her the author's descendants, sorry, um, published a paper about her ancestor. You can find that paper, I believe it's at the Dalhousie University, and she wrote a paper about Julia Hart. Her name's Dr. Lillian Maxwell. So some archival remains still exist through some recent painting restorations of paintings. I was able to find a painting of her brother, who was, as I mentioned, the mayor of Fredericton. You can see his painting right here. I was able to also find some death certificates through some family tree websites. The graves of her mother and the author are in, I believe, Fredericton, and one of the houses that her brother used to live in, the Bliss Beckwith House, is protected, although it's been currently used for businesses. And also, it's really interesting to do some organic research through, as I mentioned, her subscribers. They were prominent figures in Kingston and Fredericton. A lot of them, like the author's relatives, had conflicting views on religion and race, which was pretty normal back then. A lot of them were British, but I did notice that some of her French connections were able to get copies as well. And they also had connections with Canada's Last Duel, which I won't get too much into, but I highly recommend looking into that as it's very dramatic. And I just want to touch base on what's next. As Holly mentioned, the Heritage Minutes is very interesting and very cool, at least I think so. Production that is sponsored, I believe, by CBC, but they do very high quality productions of important filming done on historical moments in Canada, and they've expressed interest on doing one on Julia Hart. I'm currently exploring different mediums on how to bring more awareness to Canadian Romance authors. But for now, you're more than welcome to read the currently free version of St. Ursula's Convent. And also, I highly recommend if you're looking to read more about contemporary Canadian Romance authors, as I believe I mentioned before, Canlit Romance has a really good newsletter that I highly recommend that you look up and subscribe to find out more information about Canadian authors. And if you're interested in joining or attending live or in-person events that celebrate Canadian romance, there are events happening all across Canada, and more are happening and being organized. I do know from the grapevine that there may be a Canadian romance bookstore opening in Ottawa in the spring called Evermore. I'm going to have to check on the updates on that, but that was the last bit of tidbit that I heard recently when it came to Canadian news on romance novels and books. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to any questions you might have or anything that you need clarification on. Please feel free to ask me. But thank you for having me, and I hope you enjoy the talk. No, yeah, just making sure I got it. Fine. There you go.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting.
I'm just trying to stop sharing for you.
Something that I also just want to draw attention to that I find really interesting is in the cookbook world, Elizabeth, the Mrs. Beeton's book of household management is kind of like seen as the pinnacle of 19th century cooking, but our Canadian equivalent would be Catherine Partrail's The Female Emigrant's Guide. So it's almost like Julia Beckwith Hart is sort of the Canadian equivalent of Jane Austen. And given the fact that they were kind like near contemporaries and those very clear influences is fascinating.
Right.
So we do have some questions coming in.
Mm-hmm.
The first one, were any of the authors you studied ever in danger or threatened due to potentially pushing the envelope on scandalous or impolite topics in romance novels?
Yeah, so there are definitely some books that I've explored because you have to keep in mind that a lot of these books were published before the Me Too movement. So you have to go in with that in mind. And there might be harder scenes to read nowadays, knowing things like consent and how they might come across as dubious consent. But also, a challenge for me was knowing which books to include because I believe her name is, I'll get her name real quick. The author who has connections to Asian descent. I actually had to, her name was Winifred Eaton, and I actually asked my friends of Japanese descent how they felt about the representation in her books, and they weren't comfortable with it. So I've felt very conflicted about those books because I know that they were trailblazers in their own right, but because of the racism that she and her sister came across when they were alive, because it was around Pearl Harbor, and they decided at one point to pretend to be Chinese. So there's a lot of confliction around that. And then also, one thing to point out is for some scholars, the book Desert of the Heart, I forget the author's name on the top of my head, but it would be considered for a lot of scholars to be the first love story to have sapphic representation. But with my definition of a romance novel, it wouldn't fit the clear HEA ending that a lot of readers would expect. But it is worth noting because it does have a love story in it, but it doesn't have that clear-cut romance ending that readers want.
Very interesting. Second question here. Where can we access Julia's novels? So I'm assuming that's going to be the first two published ones, and if possible, the manuscript, if there's
Yeah,
copies of that around.
so there are different copies available. I would suggest going to the University of Brock if you want to get a good look in person. They have honestly been the most communicative for me. They might have limitations on who can see it, but I know that they have let their own classes go see it. So it's possible if you're a romance enthusiast, they may let you. But also, I know that there is an ebook version that I've reformatted that you can read. That's part of the bio that Holly has put together, that you're more than welcome to see it. If you would like a digital copy the of the initial first edition, I believe that's available on different websites. There are archival websites that have first editions of Canadian books available, and Project Gutenberg, I believe, has a copy. But my reformatted ebook has my research in it as well.
Wonderful. And then another question here. Are there other authors you might delve into and I'm assuming doing similar
Yeah.
case studies with?
So if you look on, I can get my website. I'm wondering, Holly, would there be a way for you to send out a follow-up email to viewers?
Yes, definitely. I
Okay,
can
I
do
will
that through
send that
Eventbrite.
link. But there is one author that I'm interested in exploring, and that's Mary Agnes Fleming. She was actually one of the first authors to get really prolific, and she introduced female characters into novels. And another author that's pretty interesting is W.E.D. Ross. He is one of the first male authors to get into Canadian romance novels. He did a lot of gothic romance, and yeah, I think it'd be kind of fascinating to read about a romance novel written by a male.
I actually have a question.
Mhm.
When you shared the image of the original edition of the book,
Yeah.
and the opening line is in the parish of Saint A, and then there's just sort of
hmm
that long line. Stylistically, I've seen that in other novels of the time period.
Yeah.
What's the reason behind that?
So some authors do it because they don't want to get flack for what they're trying to write about. I think for Julia Hart's case, she wanted to just create some sort of sensation and drama and like make it some sort of mysterious setting That's my take on it. Because she didn't start writing this manuscript when she was a teenager, so you can still see that in glimpses of the writing. But obviously it developed over time. But I think she was just wanting to make some drama and be a bit sensationalist.
All right. Well, if there's any other questions, we are still well within our time, so feel free to put those in the chat. I do like your earlier comments about the fact that she was writing this book as a teenager during the War of 1812. I can imagine that would have been a sense of escape for her during a
Yeah, for
very
sure.
tumultuous time, especially when news and information was traveling so slowly.
Hmm.
So that is definitely an interesting touchstone for that.
Oh, thank you for looking that. I didn't want to take too much time getting it for you guys, but thank you. Yes.
And okay, and another question here. Do we have any information on how her family felt about the novels?
So unfortunately we don't, but I think her mother and her cousin would have been very proud of her. The reason I say that is that her oh sorry, I meant well, her brother, her cousin, and her mother. Her brother really was a supporter of her work. You can tell that from the subscription list. He was one of her subscribers, which I think is adorable. Um, and then her mother was a writer of letters, and I think she really would have encouraged Julia Hart to practice her writing as a, just looking at as an educator. And something to note is that you can really tell how educated Julia Hart was with her knowledge of Canadian history in the book. So I think she most likely spoke a lot about her writing to her family, who would have known more about the American Revolution because they lived through it, and also just like life, what life was like back then.
That's an interesting point because I found with your summary of the book, the connections to the shipbuilders and then
Mm-hmm.
the educational side of things, like the girls'
Mm-hmm.
school versus the convent. I was like, that
Yeah.
dare I say is somewhat autobiographical, or at least taking
Oh, one thing
inspiration.
people, I just want to caution people going in. There's a lot of name changes that happen as like the almost like as a way of characters gaining a new identity, and it's sort of a tongue in cheek, but the author names the main character after herself, so you may notice that.
Okay, another question. Do you know how difficult it may have been to get a first novel published?
Yeah, well, especially because fiction wasn't really seen as well, a really respected form of entertainment back then, especially for women. A lot of women back then even wrote under pseudonyms, and um, Julia had to wait quite a number of years before she could get the right connections to get her book published. And I mean, Jane Austen really set the standard for a lot of novels, I believe. And um, it would have taken her a good while, but I think her main connection for Julia was her husband because he was a bookbinder, and I think, well, a lot of us think that like that they were able to publish her book through his connections because he probably would have known Hugh C. Thompson through his publishing or well bookbinding.
And that's a very good point as well. Like the fact that it's very clear that she comes from a well-connected family, she had access to
Mm-hmm.
education, that there's probably some things
You're
that would have
right about that,
benefited
yeah. Mm-hmm.
her exposure there a little bit.
Because I definitely think after the death of her father, who had an unfortunate end, I think her family was pretty, well, they were struggling pretty hard when it came to finances. But I think because in large part of her brother who became a mayor, they really rose up in society. And one thing I like to point out as more of a side note is that her family always had a really good reputation in Canadian society. There are letters of people describing how much they respect her and her family. And of note, through her uncle, I believe, they intermarried into Abraham Lincoln's family. So you can tell through their connections that they really well, had a lot of connections that would have helped Julia Hart publish her book.
Mm. And another question here. Do you know why her third novel was not published?
I think. Julia might have struggled a bit with finding her voice, and also potentially that just finding the right time to publish her book because she did move from the States to the Maritimes. So I think maybe there was a lot of change in her life, but also just the this it was a bit of a struggle for Canadian authors to find the audience that they wanted because of the different sizes in Canada and America. So even Ella Montgomery, unfortunately, she had to go to the States to be initially published before she got popular in Canada. But that was often the case for a lot of Canadian authors, unfortunately.
Especially with that title, Edith or the Doom.
Mm-hmm.
And another question here. Do we know how far the book reached geographically? Example, was it sold in places like BC or in the States?
Yeah, so it was published. As on the top of my head, I know it was published. Well, it at least circulated to England. She had subscribers in England, and it was very cool because I did some on my Substack. You can read a bit more about her subscribers, but on the top of the list, there was a someone who worked at the Bank of England, and I was able to confirm with the Bank of England that he actually worked with them, which was really cool. And they still had archives that could confirm that this guy worked from the 19th century, worked with them. Yeah, yeah, reached England for sure.
That's very interesting because we don't often see sort of Canadian publications making their way over there. We get the influence from England. I'm thinking
That's
in the
true. Yeah,
culinary sense. It's very rare for stuff published here and
yeah,
created here to kind of make it across the ocean in the other
right.
direction.
Yeah, and
Um,
some random person in the Bank of England, so I have no idea how he
yeah.
heard about books.
And follow up to that, do we know how much money she made on her books and what she did with the money?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that's something I'm gonna have to look more into. You can kind of get a sense of how much books would have cost if looking at older newspapers, because they'll have advertisements for recently published books. And also back then, one of the main ways that they got to read books was through circulation libraries. So they would have had to go to the circulation library, subscribe to a circulation library. And often the books were in two volumes, so they would have had to have rented, kind of like how we used to rent blockbuster movies through our circulation library. So that would be great to know, like exactly what she would have spent it on, but potentially on her family, as she did have a lot of children eventually.
Alrighty. Well, we're at 7:50, so I think if there's no other questions, that was a wonderful evening. I know we're only a couple days after Valentine's Day, so very timely with that, and also very interesting about a potential romance bookshop opening in Ottawa. It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of an
Yeah,
interesting
definitely check
connection
it
there
out.
too.
I'm pretty sure they have a website right now called Evermore. At least that's the name of the bookstore.
All right, and lots of thanks and compliments coming through in the comments
Amazing.
section.
Thank you,
So.
everyone.
Thank you so much, Christine, for joining us tonight. And thank you, everybody who was able to attend. And as always, the video will be up on our YouTube shortly. So if you want to check it out later, review some of your notes, it will be available there. So thank you again. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Amazing. Thanks, Holly. Bye, everyone.